For those of you who may have come in a little later, this little concert you just heard in recognition of the gift of a Hammond organ to the Society. It was presented by Phoebe MacDonald of Laguna Beach, according to the wishes of her sister Marjorie. Marjorie MacDonald was deeply interested in our activities here at the Society and cooperated in every way to advance our work. Marjorie, as we, at one period, gave art lessons here on Saturdays in the room which is now used as a gift shop. Marjorie's birthday was very close to Easter, so it seemed appropriate to give the first presentation of her organ today, and we thank very much and very deeply our good friend Tamia Pillsborough, who was the organist, a very proficient and wonderful young lady, and also a very good friend of the Society, and we are deeply grateful to her also. Now, this morning, we have something rather interesting that comes along on Easter. And it seems to me that in this particular difficult time, we should do some rather straight thinking on this subject, and perhaps be a little less mystical and a little more practical in our approach to some of these matters. I'd like to begin by reminding you that according to the current issue of Guinness Book of Records, between the year 1800 and the present time, 2,500 million copies of the Bible were printed and circulated. They were circulated either completely or in part, and they were circulated in 1,700 languages and dialects. It would seem, therefore, that we must face the fact that the book has had a tremendous coverage, that it has not only had this tremendous publication since the year 1800, but it has also has been published long before that time, and probably at least 500 million copies were in circulation in the early years of printing. So all over the world this book is known. And all over the world, even among other religions, the book itself is respected. It is recognized as probably the greatest moral code that has been given to mankind. Certainly it is the greatest moral code that has been given to Western society. Nearly all other religions, however, essentially have the same basic concepts. They all have the same deep desire for the spiritualization of humanity. They want human beings to live together in peace. They want nations to solve their problems and become one under the guidance of divine providence. It is therefore, I think, rather important to bear in mind that against this tremendous testimony, a testimony represented today probably by 2/3 of the population of the earth, that in these times the principal objective of religion is not flourishing. The New Testament definitely gives the admonition of Christ, "Love ye one another." This is a statement that can be applied to governments, to various institutions of learning or art. It can be applied to political systems within the structures of nations. It can be also applied to private citizens, their homes, their daily living, and everything that goes to make up the 20th century problems and projects of mankind. Yet at this very time, in Latin America, Christians are killing Christians. In the Near East, Muslims are killing Muslims. And various nations everywhere are locked in conflicts. Assassinations are becoming more or less too frequent, and in many cases are proudly claimed by these militant groups. In our own communities, we find an increasing indifference to laws and human decency. we see things that seem to be falling away from the integrities which are most necessary to survival. People who go to church on Sunday work in munition factories during the week. Everywhere, the principles are being sacrificed either to profit or to the emergencies of the hour. So on this occasion, with Easter with us, it seems that we should definitely try to understand and consecrate our lives to a more orderly procedure in harmony with the divine codes which we have received. Also, by general recognition and examination, it has been well established that of the present population of the earth, nearly 3 billion are religion-oriented. That means that over half of humanity, or at least a full half, has spiritual convictions. How does it happen that these convictions are not accomplishing any major purpose in the arbitration of world problems? Why is that part of society, which is most idealistically founded, fail to speak up in some way, to do something to indicate the recognition that the present procedures are wrong? In the 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, there have been literally thousands of wars. And they have become progressively more dangerous, more deadly, and have constantly sacrificed huge numbers of human beings. To what? Today, the materialistically oriented individual has no answer for the problem. He has no answer perhaps for the reason that while he may not believe in afterlife beyond the grave, he has no way of preventing the destruction of him while he still lives. So it is not a problem simply of a religion based upon immortality. It is a religion also that is based upon the protection of mortality to the degree that it is possible. The unbeliever and the person who breaks the common rules of world ethics has no justification and can gain very little satisfaction from the compromises that he makes. So here at Easter time, perhaps it is advantageous for us to consider the mystery of the resurrection, not in terms simply of an event that happened 2,000 years ago, but in terms of a constantly continuing event, the resurrection of realities within ourselves, within our societies, our nations, and our races. The Apostle Paul tells us in very simple words, Christ in you, the hope of glory. The second coming of the Messiah must be a coming through those who understand, cherish, and preserve his teachings. The time has come, therefore, for us to realize that the survival of Christianity is not in the hands of our political leaders. It is not in the hands of the great opinion makers in the world of material affairs. The preservation of our ideals rests squarely with ourselves as individuals. And if enough individuals decide the course of their conduct, tyrants will have very little effect against them. But the individual who believes certain principles must make every possible effort to live those principles and to make them a vital factor in his daily existence. Now, over the last 60 years, we've worked with a great many people. And we have worked with countless people who sincerely believe that they are good Christians. They believe that they appreciate and understand the mission that Christ came to accomplish. They believe that they have been brought into the sanctuary by baptism, christening, or some ritual or rite. And they also have a great hope that in the fullness of time, the great messianic mystery can be fulfilled. And yet these people, with all their convictions, are very much like those out in industry or in any other walk of activity. They some way separate their lives from their ideals and also allow conduct to conflict terribly with the ideals, hopes, and aspirations which they claim to possess. So on this Easter, it would be rather nice if we could begin making dedications to principles within ourselves. We may not be able to control the development of nuclear weapons. We may not be able to accomplish the things we desire that might be beautiful and good. But in ourselves, we can go against something that has gradually increased in menace and danger until today it stands where it could threaten the actual survival of mankind. That this should happen in a world which is largely dedicated to idealism and integrity just doesn't seem to be possible. Perhaps it is possible only from one particular cause, and that is a clear line of demarcation between belief and action. We have beliefs, but in the midst of these beliefs we fall back upon an inferior foundation of action. Let us say that within each of us is a soul that aspires to reality. Also in us, however, there is something else that continually aspires to material security and to the fulfillment of attitudes that have no foundation in truth. That the individual should believe in truth and then not have this truth modify his conduct is a sad dilemma, especially at this time. Now, what are the problems that we most commonly face in the matter of the individual who claims dedication, who claims to believe in the ideals of a spiritual life? Yet one of those persons to whom evangelists come almost annually to revive the spirit of devotion within them. Why should it be necessary to evangelize a Christian world? Where is the Christianity itself? Why do we have to have it brought back to us? Why do we have to be restored to the faith periodically? I talked to an evangelist over in Claremont some years ago, and he said that his experience was you had to save them once a year. Well, that's not a very promising outlook for things in general. Even if we had to save them only once in 10 years, it would still not be what constitutes the true spirit of our faith. It is more a matter of dedication within ourselves. Now, the dedications can be into simple things, but each individual must sometime settle down to the quiet contemplation of the relationship of his own conduct to the religion he claims to believe. If this comparison is not made correctly and constructively, something is wrong. Now, another danger that we seem to find constantly is a terrific clash of creeds. Most persons who believe in a spiritual tradition have developed a belief that they must defend a particular sect or group, that conformity is the secret of salvation, that the individual who belongs to a group must stay with that group, support it, believe it, and live it, and any departure from this group is to be cut off from salvation. Now, this is beginning to wear a little thin among modern people. It is hard to convince an individual that he must belong to a certain group in order to have the approval of deity. It would seem much more reasonable to assume that the blessing of God would be bestowed when these groups get together and each in his own way and in his own light worships the same truth. That there should be all these conflicts, an endless competition of believing, is simply an abstract form of warfare. It is not what religion was intended to be. In my experience, I have seen many homes broken by simply sectarian differences. Individuals who are heartbroken because a child did not marry into the same church. All of these things have lost the true spirit of religion. The true spirit of religion as expressed by Christ in those simple words, love ye one another. Now, loving one another is not always easy. If it was, it wouldn't be a virtue. And if it was common practice, there'd be no need to cultivate it. But it is necessary to consider it today. So if you happen to want to find in this Easter a sense of the experience of the presence of God in your own heart, if you want to really understand the messianic mystery as it has descended to us from nearly 20 centuries of human experience and suffering, then it might be very wise to look over our own conduct, look over the things we do, and remember that this conduct does extend beyond ourselves. There are very few people who make mistakes, except these mistakes go on to other people. There are very few individuals who will say a cross word that only hurts themselves. It goes on to complicate the lives of others. It is something that we all have to recognize, that our conduct becomes a kind of program of enlightenment and education. Well, one of the common things, for instance, we have to face here are broken homes. There are too many of them. And yet these broken homes are, for the most part, two persons who claim to believe in God, but have lost faith in each other. And there may be very good reasons why these complications arise. But if the individuals involved are truly sincere, placing the will of God before their own personal preferences in matters, they may find, would find, that the decision based upon a spiritual cooperation would bring greater comfort, greater permanence, and greater solution, and would bring far less sorrow into the family. The same is true in matters of children, that the children should not have the proper care because of selfishness of parents is contributing to a dangerous situation in society. Even the Chinese knew this. They knew that when the time comes and respect within the family breaks down, the nation is lost. There are all kinds of feuds that arise in life. There are memories that we have to get rid of. Now, we can't really get rid of a memory in the sense of saying, I'm not going to remember. But we can gradually transform an unpleasant memory into a valuable lesson. When we look back, we should not think, first of all, of how we have been wronged. We should think, rather, what our own responsibility was. Did we share in this guilt? Were we partly, at least, responsible? And if possible, is there some way of reconciling these differences? It is unfortunate indeed for any person to leave this world leaving an unsolved difference behind them. All these things are part of a religion that is based primarily, as Emerson pointed out, upon conduct, upon the individual living his faith, living it and allowing through this living of his faith for an eternal power to come through into him and through him into the world. If there is no love in our own hearts, it is going to be very difficult to bring peace into the world, or arbitrate the differences of beliefs, or prevent those who love God from killing each other. This type of situation is getting critical. And while to most of us the solution cannot reach out into the larger world, over which we have no influence, really, it does reach into an area of influence which each of us has. We have some friends, some relations, some acquaintances, some responsibilities, some decisions, which if improved and in various ways religiously oriented could be a great help to bring better situations to this troubled community we live in and call the earth. Actually, almost all of our selfishness is so short-sighted. It isn't very much good to us even while we are thinking that we are making ourselves happy. Selfishness actually doesn't help to make people happy. There's an old saying, I think Josh Billings may have said it first, and that is that whenever we get what we think we want, it loses interest, and we must want something else. And this is because most of the things we want really are not interesting. They hold our attention because they require a certain amount of specialized effort. But once acquired, they lose all value. And most of the projects which get us into trouble have no permanent or enduring significance. They are things we'd be just as well off without, even though we may not realize it at the time. Also, we now find, wandering about our streets and everywhere, delinquent young people. And we like to assume that this delinquency is due to conditions beyond our control. It may be that much of it is difficult for the individual to take over, but there are opportunities for each person. I've had too many come to me with the problems not to realize that wherever a problem arises, the thoughtful person can do something about it. Whereas the individual who is completely selfish, self-centered, and interested only in his own affairs simply contributes to the miseries of mankind, accomplishing nothing for himself that is permanent and doing no good to others. Therefore, at Easter, I think we want to begin to think in terms of the mystery of a resurrection of realities in our own hearts and minds, a wiser use of our worldly goods, a greater dedication to the suffering of mankind and what we can do about it, a better sharing not only of what we have but what we are, greater tolerance and patience, greater kindness in moments of emergency, a greater tendency not to think first of ourselves. Our enemies, nationally, internationally, racially, culturally, are mostly selfishness and ambition, the tremendous determination to advance our own ends. For this particular reason, we are perfectly willing to sacrifice human life because it will give us here a good opportunity to make wealth by devising methods to destroy other people. All of this selfish production deals with a factor that we are all going to have to face, and it may be an unpleasant head-on collision when it comes. Little by little, we have become wealth-oriented. Wealth takes the place of conscience. To accumulate is more important than to become better. To hold on to what we have desperately, even if it takes all the energy of our living to do it, is more important than holding out a helping hand to anyone else. This wealth orientation is also, of course, part of a very interesting pattern that arises in society. The powers that be in this world have only one way, really, of working with us, and that is they have to allow us to get into a certain amount of trouble in order that we can learn what it is necessary for us to know. We have to learn through suffering because we have refused to learn any other way. We have found no real joy in unselfishness in comparison to the joy of being selfish and getting what we want. And we don't think of this as wrong in any sense of the word, and we could moralize it indefinitely, and there wouldn't seem to be much wrong with it. The only thing that's wrong with it is while it's going on, the world is getting worse. Something is the matter. And the matter is very largely indifference to the rules of the game of life. We should know better than we do. We know the mysteries of birth and life and death. We realize every day of our lives that the path of glory leads but to the grave. We know all the time we can take nothing with us, and yet we struggle bitterly to the end, hoping we can depart with what we have in both hands. We can't seem to recognize, by perspective, the grand total of our misunderstanding of life. That we are actually unable to put together the simple facts and try to glamorize an illusion to the degree that it becomes worth living for. So the grande illusion goes on. The individual follows the way of the ages, to be born, to suffer, and to die, as the Caliph of Baghdad is supposed to have said. And this becomes a rule. And yet, why does it have to be a rule? Why should not the interval between birth and the departure from here be a wonderful adventure? Why should we settle down to the fact that we must turn it into a battlefield or worry day and night over the rise and fall of the securities markets? Why should we make everything here difficult when in reality we have every opportunity to have a rather nice life? Most persons are born with reasonable health. Most persons have some abilities or talents that they can use successfully. The majority of well-intentioned individuals are willing to make a living. But all through all these convictions, terrific exaggerations of emotion and thought corrupt the morality and ethics of it all. We become completely absorbed in an illusion, in something that is not real, but which destroys the wonderful things that are real. And the wonderful things that are real are peace, happiness, reasonable security, friendship, kindness, and these gentle virtues by which we can all live our span of lives without unreasonable suffering. Also, we know, medically speaking, that the more upset, the more confused, the more conflicting we become, the more quickly we'll break down the physical body as well as the mental and emotional life. Most individuals take many years from their lives in the desperate effort to accumulate something to live for, and still do not succeed. So this type of thinking needs a general revision of attitudes. And actually, we have this tremendous spiritual promise. We have the idea of the eternal power sending into the world great teachers to help us, great spirits to ensoul and lead us, and wonderful privileges to learn. We have the constant example of what really is important. Now, another interesting or somewhat conflicting remark is that the people in this world who are breaking all the rules cherish the memories of those who keep the rules. We honor mostly not the powerful or the rich or the dominant characters of life. We actually honor most those who have had least of the world's goods, but have given the most of hope and understanding to the human heart. Jesus, they say, had no place to lay his head. He was poor to the end and has become the uncrowned king of the world. But those who claim that they admire him more than anyone else do not fully understand him when he says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Now, if the Christian loves Christ, he must keep the commandments. He must keep the rules. And if he keeps the rules will keep him. If he breaks the rules, the breaking of them will break him. So we believe in these things. We cherish them. So the time has come when we must do something about them to create a better condition for the future. Buddha renounced an empire, or a kingdom at least, and went out as a beggar to the world. Confucius left all in order to teach. Lao Tzu, disillusioned, went out into the Gobi Desert, leaving behind a world that never understood him or what he was trying to do. Muhammad was poisoned. Pythagoras was assassinated. Zoroaster had a spear in his back. Those who have loved man most were also most hated. They were feared because they would destroy the idea of temporality, which we are trying to sell ourselves and have been trying ever since the beginning of history. We are trying desperately to live in a world too small for us. We want to stay in the world where we can do exactly as we please at the expense of everyone else. We do not want anything to interfere with the little private empires that we want to build. Therefore, if someone comes along, we crucify them, and centuries later we glorify them. Bernard Shaw made a great point of this in his story of St. Joanne, where all the world honors Joan of Arc for her visions and her sacrifice and her martyrdom. But as Shaw pointed out, if she was born again today, she would be burned at the stake again. Because what she interfered with was the whole self-centeredness of a humanity, which should be God-centered, which should be centered in integrities, but is not largely centered in personal advantages. So at Easter, I think it'd be very good to try to make peace with realities. Not necessarily just because we know they're right, but also because we want to be more or less practical people. And the most practical people are those who keep the principles. Those who break the principles are never practical, although they may seem for a short time to enjoy certain advantages. No one can ever break the rules without ultimately getting into desperate conditions. So if we really want to start out and try to live a Christian life, and live it in the little nasty, nagging things which make up daily living, then it is very important to start in to get rid of ulterior motives, jealousies, vengeances of all kinds, negative thinking, negative speaking, disillusionment, and this strange aggressiveness against our neighbors. All these things just don't fit in to a program for Easter. Perhaps what we need most of all is to emerge from the shell that we have built around ourselves and look at ourselves as a group of little newborn chicks which have done nothing to hurt anybody, but may have an unfortunate life if they're not careful. We should, in a sense, start a new life. And every Easter is a challenge to a rebirth, a birth into a higher level of personal awareness, a rebirth into a new recognition of world integrities, a belief that there's something bigger than munitions, armament, and nuclear physics, that we live in a world which none of us really understands. We look out at the sky at night and see the stars. We look down to the earth and see green things breaking through, and at this season of the year the earth is fruitful, and most of the wonderful beauties of nature come out of the earth to be reborn again. Trees are reborn from the darkness of winter. Everywhere nature takes on a new life because of the coming of the sun at the vernal equinox. In a sense, therefore, the Christian mystery has to do with the Sun of Glory, the tremendous light of inward love and faith, and the signification of its resurrection every year at the vernal equinox. The ancients worshipped the vernal equinox because it became a symbol of a revelation of integrities. It became a symbol of the annual rebirth of hope. rebirth of faith in humanity, of charity, and of all the good things we long for. It would be good, therefore, that in our personal living, every year at Easter, there would be another release of our own divine content, our divine internal, that on this particular day we should herald again the glorious rebirth of light and truth, that we should overcome the belief in death and realize the mystery of life everlasting. Each year could be a time for a new statement of faith, a new review of the year that is gone. Pythagoras of Samos recommended that the philosophical-minded people look back over a period of time, a year or even a day, and try to see what it really meant. That it is not something you just forget about and dash on to something new. Look back over a year and find out what you learned. Find out whether you have learned to have greater faith or have lost more faith. Whether you have been able to remedy some mysteries and some misfortunes of life or have simply made new ones. Perhaps you have regained a friend that was lost. Perhaps you have lost a friend that you could have saved. Look over the year and see what it all adds up to in a great pattern far beyond the boundaries of our homes, our communities, and our planet. That all of these processes have to do with life. And the life in us is the same as the life in the star. We are all part of one eternal life in eternal manifestation. And it is our privilege and our right to channel this life, this light, into ways of integrity and creativity. It is perfectly possible to recognize the problem of the Last Supper, in which we find the symbolism of truth becoming the nourisher of reality, hope, and love, dying for us. And that at the Last Supper we have the symbol of truth being sacrificed for us and being fed to us, that by this union, as in the Pentecostal mystery, we partake in the eternity of the life, body, and blood of truth and salvation. Therefore, that at this season, the truth that went into us, maybe over a period not only of years, but of many lives, the truth that was locked in us from the beginning of existence, the truth that is locked in every star, in every planet, in every cosmic system, that truth should be celebrated on this day because of its resurrection, and we should provide it with the opportunity to reveal more of itself. That in each year as goes by, the inner life of the individual should have greater expression. We should have more opening up of the inner and not have it constantly imprisoned by the selfishness of the lower personality. It is said that, of course, in St. Augustine in his City of God pointed out that the City of God was the symbol of holiness, and that the opposite end of this great mystery was the city of Babylon, the city of confusion and death, the city that's represented by the cities of the plains, and all the mysteries of creation and degeneration. That actually that the city of Babylon is the abode of confusion. And if we study the biblical descriptions of these cities of the plains that were destroyed, we find something rather reminiscent of our own present condition. We find how we have departed from truth, how we have neglected up to read the handwriting on the wall of heaven, that we have also in our feasting sacrificed our integrities. Now, if were true that there was no guidance, that each creature that comes in here must struggle and die the best it can, if this was the reality of things, it would be very sad indeed. But it is not the reality. We have received from the beginning of history magnificent messages of hope. We have seen great works of mercy. We have beheld miracles that no materialistic culture could perform. We know the way of light.
We know the life everlasting. We do not have to wander in insecurity, doubt, and darkness. We know better. But between the knowing and doing, there is this something that is interposed, a tremendous self-conceit, a self-seeking search for personal advantage, selfishness, and egotism, and the inability of the individual to contemplate the possibility that he is making a mistake. This arrogance in us stands between us and the things we most want, the things we most need. And as long as we continue to break all the rules, we will continue in trouble. Looking out as we do at the present time, it is embarrassing indeed to find that there are scarcely any efforts to cooperate between various structures of society. There are hundreds of little groups fighting for certain special privileges. Every group wants advantage for itself, not for all. It wants to be the leader, not one of many. Each of these groups will go on strike and even go into violence in order to gain some temporal advantage, paid for by the blood and life of their fellow human beings. All this goes on, and it all is assumed to be right and proper, the way it was intended to be. Cruelty was never intended to be. Cruelty was the result of being blinded to what was intended to be. Now, most people today are getting a little tired and a little sick and a little worried and a little frightened. Therefore, perhaps as never before, this Easter has the power and the strength to really get in at our own internal lives. That now we are sufficiently disillusioned with what we are having and what we're getting, that we will gradually learn to rectify conduct. It doesn't mean that we have to go on a strike and assassinate some more people. It means, however, that we can simply do that which we believe to be right and refrain from doing that which we believe to be wrong. We do not have to attack people, but we do not have to cooperate with error, especially on the ground that it's a little bit more advantageous for us. We do not have to make the mistakes that others make. And I think one of the old saints was very wise in his remark that evil actions become known to all. Virtuous actions usually remain unknown. Make the mistakes that others make. And I think one of the old saints was very wise in his remark that evil actions become known to all. Virtuous actions usually remain unknown. This is perhaps the best. The inner life of the individual is not worn on his sleeve. It is not something that he has to talk about, that he has to be persecuted for or ridiculed for. The good life is something simply to live straight. And to the most part, in the long run, this is respected. But it causes no violence in society. As the scriptures have pointed out, the treasures that are stored up in the inner life of the individual are not taken from any other person. No one is poorer because we get stronger in righteousness. No one is deprived because we gain greater insights. Material problems make us perhaps pauperize each other, but the spiritual integrities of life help us to redeem and enlighten and protect each other throughout all the years of life. Now, there are various ways of trying to get to this point, and one of the ways, I think, is through a kind of meditative visualization of the situations as they exist. Behind this little thin veil that divides the physical world from what we cannot see, behind this veil is everything that is important. And we haven't quite got the vision to see it. Some think they have and hope they have, but very often their testimonies are arbitrary and conflicting. One thing is true, however. that through a kind of internal meditation upon the realities of life, the recognition of big things in nature and in the universe, things that we may see either in a great tree or in a tiny flower at the foot of a bush, things that bring to us nature, that show us the infinite diversity of activities which make up life, the ever-present manifestations of a divine energy, that all things live because of one life. All things live because that one life is growing in them. And the growth of that life is evolution. It is the spiritual ideation, the final unfurling and unfolding of the great divine potential in the end, that we may all become as gods, knowing good and evil. That must come in the due course of time, that we shall become this particular being, a being in which the perfection of life is glorified, and that we become great not in ourselves, but because of an eternal greatness that lives within us. The Oriental mind, particularly in the Northern Buddhist system, uses the concept of the Lord Maitreya to recognize the ever-coming reality. The word Maitreya, or the Buddha to come, who is waiting to be born into this material world, is a personification of a principle. It is not a man sitting up in a heaven somewhere waiting to be born, or a woman doing the same. The actual point of it is that the ever-coming Messiah, called Maitreya in the Orient, is simply a word which means kindness. The word Maitreya, the Savior of all nations, is kindness, and it is to come. It is waiting somewhere to come into the lives of all of us. Kindness is the healing power. It is the miracle. Kindness winds its way through all phases of existence. It binds up all wounds. It ends all animosities. It closes forever the gates of wrath. So somewhere this kindness is. And one place where we know it is in ourselves. We have had moments of it. There have been moments when we were very kind. Then there were moments in which we forgot to be kind. There are moments when we have been heroic in the terms of the expression of the best parts of ourselves. But then we get back to the daily procedures of life, and all these things fade out, and we begin again to nurse our little selfishness at the expense of the greater part of ourselves. Now, what is the answer to it? Supposing we did try to cultivate kindness, that we recognize that wherever kindness is, the blessing of heaven is upon it and upon those who practice it. Supposing we say, well, that's going to be very expensive. If we're really kind, we're going to have to forgive people for things they've done to us that we don't think were fair. We have to try to get over the common impulses to improve our situations. We have to get over the tendency to be a little unscrupulous in the fulfillment of our own ambitions. These things are going to be difficult. The question is this true? It might be true if we were going to be here forever. But what is the reason why we cannot do these things in the view of the fact that in a short time we just aren't going to be here for a while? And we may be back, but if we come back, we will be ruled by the degree of kindness that we have developed. The one thing we can take with us is self-improvement. And if self-improvement is nursed and nourished, it is the one asset that can come out of material life. 10% on the bonds won't. None of these things can. They may all be all right in their place, but wherever the individual allows unkindness to motivate his action, he is committing a mistake. And that mistake is going to stay with him until he corrects it. And it is always going to stand between him and joy, between him and peace of soul, between him and his own conscience. Now, conscience is very valuable in this particular situation. Some have felt that conscience is a sort of hereditary virtue, a sort of self-hypnosis. But it isn't, because conscience tells us very definitely when we violate our own code. Conscience may not interfere with us if we don't agree with someone else. But if we commit an action detrimental to our own life, conscience is there. But this little voice of conscience seems to be getting weaker every day. And very few people now allow it to interfere with anything they want to do. But here we have a world in which we're not going to be able to want to do these things. It's closing in all the time. The mistakes we have made are becoming more and more difficult to remedy. Therefore, we must begin to realize that we may have to live for quite a while in an environment almost completely dominated by mistakes, things that shouldn't be, things that should not have occurred, but did. To meet this, we have to have strength of internal character. If we don't have strength, we will fall back on corruption and perhaps find life completely miserable. We have to have strength of character to face the way things are now. And it is because we haven't developed that strength in the past that things are as they are now. So at the moment, the most important thing we can do is to develop a sufficient degree of strength to sustain us through difficulties, through tragedy if necessary. But if it's tragedy, it is tragedy we have earned, through thoughtlessness and selfishness. But we have to have greater strength than we have now in order to face the present world confusion with peace of mind. And faith is the only thing that we have that can stand against the disasters of life. And this faith is not an excuse. It is not an evasion. It is not something we simply do to try to deceive ourselves. Faith is a deep realization that the truth exists, that we are part of that truth, that in spite of anything we can do or try to do, that truth is still there. We must make peace with that truth, for the truth in itself cannot make peace with us. We have to make the gesture, the motion ourselves. And if we do this, we can find out a little bit about, for instance, the Pythagorean discipline that I just mentioned. Namely, that by looking back into a day or a week or a year, we see a microcosm of our entire lives. We can understand the motions that dominated us. We can realize how early childhood affected us, how much we developed and how much revenge we nursed, and how we determined to get back at society because something it did to hurt us, or why we haven't been able to go on loving everybody because someone deceived us. Why it is, therefore, that almost everything that goes wrong is remembered, and everything that is right is more or less overlooked. Little by little we become more and more pessimistic, more and more doubting, and more alone because of our own attitudes. So we should look back over these things and see what we can do to straighten them out. With a little effort, you can probably turn a long period of disillusionment into a pretty nice time of life. We can see that we misjudged things, we talked too much, we carried stories that were not true, and if they were true, they were none of our business, and little by little we got into trouble. So we can look back and we can say, well, I don't think I graduated from my own past cum laude or anything of that nature. It probably nearly flunked the course up to now. But there's always a possibility of making a great advance by watching the result of past mistakes. So this Easter, let's try to say honestly and firmly and really that we do not have an enemy in the world, that we have no one we wish evil to or ill. We have no one we are afraid to meet tomorrow or today, that we have nothing in our lives or in our relationships with life that we cannot face constructively. that if the truth needs to be told, we will tell it. But we will tell it always with kindness, never with bitterness. We will never insult other people because we think they deserve it. The more they deserve it, the more they need help. Everyone who is wrong is suffering from some kind of mental, emotional, or physical sickness. Selfishness is a sickness. Hate is a sickness. And the hate is a sickness that is worse than any malignancy that you can have in the body. All of these things we can think through. We can begin to figure out how we could make a better life. This is part of the secret of the Oriental mandala philosophy. A mandala is a visualizing or a picture meant to represent a spiritual reality. Spiritual realities cannot be actually visually seen. They are far off in the great world of causes, but they can be experienced to various degrees. And the experiences suggest patterns, parables, allegories, fables, and emblems. This recognition of the nature of the infinite cannot be brought to us on a film or something of this nature, but we can build within ourselves the vision of its proportions, the shape of it, the glory of it. We can, to a sense, gain for it a certain form, a likeness, a habitation in a body of some kind, if that body is only our own thought. But if we begin to glorify the invisible, if this becomes more and more wondrous and luminous, it also gives us greater strength with which to fight the problems of the visible. We will no longer regard things around us as omnipotent, and will begin to move our faith, our hope, and our conviction towards this vastness which we begin to experience and which we know has to be there. There's nothing else that could support the galaxies that go on forever. There's nothing else that could ensoul all forms. There is nothing else that could give us the power of sight or the power of thought. All these things represent forces beyond our comprehension. But we know they're there, and we know, therefore, that they are part of a plan, and that we are all purposed creatures, not individuals simply floating around in a mist of matter. So with this realization coming gradually through us, it becomes much easier and less difficult for us to experience the kind of life that we need, the kind of life that will bring us internal peace. And at Easter time, we can imagine that you're standing perhaps in a great cathedral like Chartres, or perhaps one of the most beautifully ornamented, the Cathedral of San Marco in Venice. Here, the walls and the ceilings are covered with the most beautiful mosaic pictures. Pictures in the domes of the various rooms that rise up like clouds into the sky. We see the heavens unfold, as in the chapel of the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel. Everywhere, these mosaics, paintings, symbols represent a larger world, a world beyond our comprehension, really, but a world which, in some mysterious way, we know has to be there. Because if it was not there, we would not be here. We are inevitably bound to causes that we cannot see, without which our own existence would be impossible. So we look up at all these beautiful pictures that are dreams, ideals, visions, inner convictions of exalted moments in the life of an artist or in the life of a great cleric. And in these things, it seems as though the sky is opened and we behold the glory of the infinite. Now, in our own little private life, Bamy, the German mystic, was one who had this experience of the opening up of something beyond the common sight of man. He had this inward vision in which for a moment he beheld the glory of the world. He beheld the infinite expanse of power that was necessary to make a grain of sand exist. He recognized for a moment the light that ensouls and ennobles a seashell. He began to sense all of the glories that surround a budding flower, and most of all, the tremendous cosmic progress, the pattern of things, the infinite pageantry of causation, a pageantry which can be mysteriously felt in a moment of ecstasy. Ecstasy which is to religion what hysteria is to problems. This is the tremendous vision that Bamey had. He beheld the great light of things, and he realized that behind it all, somewhere, is the supreme mystery. A mystery that cannot fail, that is absolute, that nothing can add to or detract from, and that is in this mystery that everything that exists lives and moves and has its being. And it is the power of this wonder that helps all of us in our own small lives to live better, to live more constructively. It helps us to understand, and most of all, perhaps, it gives us faith. The faith that comes from the sensing, the intuitive realization that there is this greater thing, this more than we can ever hope to understand. Certain visions have come down to us relating to it. Mystics have described it in various ways. Perhaps their descriptions are all tinctured by their own personal developments. But still they have sensed, as Plotinus did, the tremendous power of that which can be experienced occasionally in the inwardness of things. Plotinus mentions that for one instant he was aware of reality. For a moment the great gates opened, and then they closed again. But for that moment, he lived the rest of his life. He needed no more. He had suddenly had an experience that convinced him beyond doubt of the tremendous integrities of life. Now, from some way, we're going to have to restore the experience of integrities. We are going to have to find our way of bringing our world back into order. We are going to have to discover what love really is. That love is not in being loved, but in loving. That love, as St. Francis pointed out, is the individual without reservation, bestowing the noblest of his emotions upon those around him, expecting nothing in return. That the great power of things that is in the innermost, this mystery that Bamey tried to describe, gives forever and asks nothing. The power of good is fulfilled by its own bestowing. That all that is beautiful and noble is its own reward. And the quiet life of intelligent integrity is itself a greater reward than any bestowal could possibly be. For it simply means that the individual has got back in line with the facts of life. So at Easter this year, we're working hard. Many people are now becoming more and more aware of the challenge of the day. Millions of people today are beginning to realize that the problem is a challenge, that it is not something that was simply dropped on them for no good reason. More and more of us are realizing that the mistakes that have been made are the reason for the problems that are now facing us. And there is a grand motion, a very definite motion, toward the restoration of the integrities of life. At this time it is limited to a few, comparatively, but it is in the hearts of many. Many people are planning changes in their ways of doing things. They are planning to build better structures. Educational reforms are taking on tremendous momentum. And it is becoming obvious that the only education that counts is the education that is built upon the great cosmic pattern by which we are all educated. Little by little, we have to learn that education means the bringing out from within ourselves of the divine power, that is deposited there in eternity. Educo, meaning to draw forth, has been interpreted to mean cram in. We have crammed in all the things we didn't need to know. We have built up a tremendous reputation for abilities that will only serve us until we retire. But the thing that has to happen is that conscience and consciousness have to come through the individual. We have to be taught to become what one Montaigne, I think, once called a pen in the hands of a ready writer. This coming through from within is the real end of education. The real end of society is that, as Cicero said, society has as its ultimate that all human beings will live together in social compatibility. Society means that. Civilization means that we shall all be civil, that we shall not build upon differences but upon common causes. All the way along, people are beginning to realize this. There is a strong movement now to reform the entertainment field. We're getting hopelessly disillusioned. We're getting bored to death by an inundation of commercialisms. But we have done it. Each individual who thinks he's got 5 cents to profit keeps it up. But gradually it is becoming so obnoxious that most people are disillusioned. The returns and records and announcements on various reports show that entertainment field is losing ground very rapidly. Why should it? Because to the large measure of things it isn't entertaining. Actually, entertainment must be useful. Entertainment must help the individual to see the values of life. Entertainment must have certain background in realities. And it must also inevitably point out the importance of that which is the best. Until these things happen, entertainment will be contrary to the conscience of many people. And this conscience is becoming more irritated every day. The same is true in land allotments, in food, in clothing, in natural resources. All these are gradually coming into focus as proof of the fact that we have been indifferent to integrities, that we have been thoughtless, and that we have allowed personal and immediate considerations to destroy the world, or try to destroy the world, which was given to us to beautify and protect. So little by little, the Christ in us, which is the hope of glory, is breaking through. We are finding it in nations that have long been trying to establish godless societies. The godless do not increase in number. The godless are not gaining in power. Many of them are turning back to something that gave them internal consolation in integrities. Little by little, in many countries which were considered atheistic, the churches, the mosques, the temples, the cathedrals are opening again. Why? Because, as Napoleon once pointed out, you cannot rule a people unless that people have a religion that is strong enough to take them through the problems of life. So that all the way along, the motion now is toward perhaps the thing that we have talked about. Perhaps the second coming is a new channel on television station. Perhaps it is a director who decides to make a really good picture. Perhaps it's an author who's going to write a book for the good of humanity and not for royalties alone. It will also come when products are improved, and the manufacturer says, I'm going to make a good product. The moment he says it's a good one and he makes it, he is tuning in to the great realities of life. The same will be true with health. We will discover that it is not necessary to exploit the sickness and miseries of each other. Little by little, these laws and rules will be changed. Little by little, the experience of humanity inevitably brings us back to the truth. We can't get along without it. Therefore, all the deceits of the ages, the thousands of wars of the past, the inquisitions and the conquests, which have mutilated society from the beginning, these will gradually destroy themselves, because they cannot continue. We are gradually reaching a point where we have exhausted the potentials of our own stupidity. We have no longer anything to support the foolishness that we continue to consider to be so important. So I think we must accept the simple truth, namely, that every Easter things are going to be a little better, because every year that lies between is going to make changes more inevitable. And Nostradamus, in his predictions, for example, described that in the next century there would be the coming of the Paraclete, the Prince of Peace, that we are coming closer and closer to the time when reality is going to break through with a crash. Reality is going to come through, and it is not going to be a deathbed conversion. It's not going to come when it's too late to do any good. It is going to come as the intensities of the present problems become obvious. That when we look at the world today, we must all, I think, admit that it is in foul condition. It is in miserable condition. It cannot go on this way indefinitely. We will have more wars and rumors of wars, but there will not be such long ones. Not so many people will fight them. Not so many people are going to be intimidated into doing wrong for self-preservation's sake. Little by little, these things are going to clear. And looking over the last year's reports, there seem to be so many rather hopeful signs and indications of people waking up, finding new values, finding greater privilege and opportunity in working with the young and taking care of the desolate. We are becoming here a nation accepting into ourselves the sufferers from 50 countries. Now, it may seem this is a terrible strain upon us, but I think it is the way that Christ would have wanted it, namely, that we shall take care of the little ones, and that those who suffer, we shall sacrifice for them if necessary. All the way along, the sorrows are bringing their own solutions. Peoples are beginning to find new goals, new rewards for action. A simple society, run on normal processes and principles, and dominated by brotherly love, could solve most of our problems. We may say that it would be hard on the economic system. It wouldn't be, because the economic system has always existed primarily for one purpose, and that is a convenience. An economic system makes it unnecessary for the individual to carry the groceries in his own pocket. He can buy and sell without delivering the animal right there on the marketplace. He can do things, he can have things through a great exchange. This can continue. There can always be proper exchange, but it can be fair and honorable and just. We can do all the things that are right, and having done them right, we will observe a quietude, a peace, a gentleness coming in. We shall not be troubled by people who are led to narcotics and alcohol simply by the stress and weakness of their own natures. Little by little, it's going to come through. I feel perfectly satisfied, and always have, that never will this world be left without the guidance it needs. The only problem we have is to recognize it when it comes. If we don't recognize it, that isn't even so desperately bad, because it's going to come whether we recognize it or not. And we're going to have to live with it. And for a moment it may seem rather oppressive, but in a little while we shall discover that it is easier to be happy and honest than it is to be ambitious and dishonest. All the things that we don't like are going to gradually be transformed into what is right, or we will learn to like that which is best. So on Easter, I think we ought to think about these things as much as we can with a view of making new resolutions in ourselves and trying in our own hearts and minds to see the sky open and the heavenly victory of truth over the injustices of material existence. We are victims of a material ignorance, but only when we do have contact with the inner part of our own lives can this ignorance be corrected. And the ancient symbols, the mandalas, the various emblems and diagrams of the past, the visions of the great artists, the Madonnas of Raphael and Tintoretto, all these great works of art are inspirational works, all based upon the concept of the reality of something sacred, something important, something divine, by which we can lift ourselves out of the mire of our own making. Therefore, at this time in Easter, I think when we sit down to Easter dinner or something, we should have a little prayer in our hearts and minds that our eyes may be opened. For it is in the opening of our eyes that we experience the second coming. It is in the opening of the eyes that we behold the resurrection of truth out of the darkness of error. It is always happening, but we do not have the eyes to see it. When our own hearts and minds illumine our visual equipment, we will see that forever the truth is becoming. It is coming always. It is always unfolding through life and through living things. It is unfolding through us if we will permit it. And by kindness and thoughtfulness and gentleness, we are bringing closer and closer the day of the great liberation, when there shall be one sheepfold and one shepherd. Until then, until we have the vision to see they have always been one, we will have to continue to gradually overcome the differences, overcome the short-sightedness, overcome the thoughtlessness which have so long bothered us. It might also be a very good day today to telephone someone you haven't talked to for a long time and see if you can mend some little misunderstanding. Try and be bigger than something else. Try and not do it for the sake of your own good, but in order that the Christ in you may have a victory. For in every kindness there is a victory for good. Every unkindness is a defeat for the good that is in all of us. And when we have enough unkindness, then darkness rules. And the time has come now where kindness is getting to be necessary, is getting to be something we can't afford to go without much longer. So wherever we go and whatever we do, let's try to be cheerful. Let us know that God is in His heavens and all is right with the world. Let us have faith in the integrities of life. And with the rebirth of faith in our own hearts and minds, we have the resurrection of faith in the world. And in each of us, the mystery must first be celebrated. We must first discover that our faith is stronger than our fear, that we can go forth doing the things that are necessary, ready and willing to bear the responsibilities of constructive action. Until then, we will have the same problems. We can't go much longer. The nuclear warfare is around corners, but it will not be allowed to hurt. It will not come to its ultimate victory, because there can only be one victory, and that is the victory of love. Everything else must pass away. All the hates and selfishness of empires. The great empires of the past are gone. The empires of the future will go also, unless truth controls and directs their existence. And we are now not only able to see these things, but we can read about them. History is available to us. There is much to inspire us to make the changes in ourselves that are desperately necessary. And when we make these changes, we shall no longer fear. There will be no fear of what might happen to us, or what we have, or who we are. These things cease when a great faith takes over, and we realize that at all times and forever we are part of a divine plan, and the God in us can no more die than the God in space. This is something we have to learn to understand and recognize and do the best we can with. But let's, in Easter this year, let's try to think through some action. It's only a small one. And say, I do this in the name of the Lord. I do this little deed. I give to someone who needs. I say an encouraging word to someone who is in tears or in sorrow. I hold out friendship to someone who is alone. I try to bring peace to a troubled person. And if what is necessary is a loaf of bread, I'll find that too. I will do something as a restatement of my bond with heaven. I will do something to prove that I still believe that love is supreme, and that all the problems of fear and hate are not strong enough to destroy the principle of human goodness that is locked within us all. And so, for all of you, I wish you a very happy Easter.
Materialisme froid.